we take a step back in time from the fourth industrial revolution of today to the industrial revolution from the mid-18th to early 20th century, we see that then education was a driver for technological advances, which led to a sustained period of prosperity. But now in the fourth industrial revolution, technology is outgrowing and outpacing changes in education. A study by Goldwyn and Katz says that when the demands and developments of technology exceed the education and skills of children and adults, there can be a gap in productivity and prosperity. Is this indeed the position we are currently in? Let's meet the panelists.
Dan Adkins, Group CEO, Transnational Academic Group. Bradley Pulford, VP and MD, HP Africa. Professor Barry Dwalatsky, Director of Innovation Strategy at the University of the Witwatersrand. Suraj Shah, Lead, Regional Center for Innovative Teaching and Learning in ICT, MasterCard Foundation. And the moderator is CNBC Africa anchor, Tanya Habimana.
And a big welcome to all of you, my panelists. A very important conversation. Technology challenges in education. I mean, when we look at the advancement that we've had in technology, and like we said, education has been a driver, but has education caught up? And I'd like to start off by asking you, Bradley, how is education being reinvented in this new digital age that we find ourselves in?
Yeah, Tanya, thank you. And it's such an important subject that we have to consider, across the Africa continent. And when you think about the continent being so youthful in its spirit, 224 million, children between the ages of 15, 24 alone, this creates an immense amount of focus around education. So a couple of things from our side. I think as the world continues to adapt to virtual and remote working, we need to consider some of the adjustments that are required in education as well. This becomes very important. And technology can support learning using hybrid ways of in-classroom, as well as, learning tools and resources that will help the development and the advancement of students alike across the continent. What is critical is if you have a look at some of the information and the data, according to OECD, just as an example, 15-year-olds globally that are enrolled at schools have some form of access to online learning, which just shows the digital divide that we have, not only across Africa, but across the globe as well. And when you consider that 65% of children entering school today are most likely going to be in jobs that don't exist, technology becomes a critical equalizer in terms of how we need to be ready for some of these skills that we see in the future. And in a world where humans are augmented by AI, I think creativity and collaboration has become probably the most sought after value set, if you like, skill set that we need to enable and empower as we look to the future. And this is where technology becomes enormously critical for the needs of our kids, I think, in the future as well. And so while we have shifted to new normalities, I think within the technology space specifically, it's really reinforced just how important, we need to have access to technology, which is so critical for today as well, but also to how to use that technology in order to make these advancements. And both for educators, but more importantly also for some of those learners, those students as well. This becomes very, very important.
Yeah, and when you talk about that, and especially when you talk about the opportunities that technology have given us and normalizing technology, we can't help but think of the COVID-19 pandemic and how that has really acted as a propulsor. But I'd like to, when we think about the propulsing effect of the COVID-19 pandemic, we also have to think about the divide that it's created and how it's accentuated that. So I want to ask this to Professor Barry. I mean, was the pandemic as transformative and propulsive as we all think it was?
So I think that we've got a bit carried away with the perceived effects of the COVID period. Yes, we moved almost instantly from having students and learners in the classroom to having them or some of them at home. And we carried on teaching, we carried on doing our business as teachers and educators. But I question whether it was really transformative or whether it was simply digitalization. So did we take the modes of teaching and learning that we've used for decades in our classrooms and just made them digital? Or have we really rethought and transformed and innovated how we do teaching and learning? And I think my experience and my colleagues' experience has been that there has been digitalization without any question, but there's been very little digital transformation of teaching and learning in our universities and even universities across the world. So I think that the pressure to change is there, but we still have to see the real transformative changes happen within the fields of learning, teaching, and generally education.
And that's quite transformative in what you're saying is, have we just digitized what we were doing already? And I want to ask my next question to Dan. How has the curriculum changed to be technology enabled, or are we simply doing the same thing as we were before?
I think that's a fantastic question. I think Professor Barry summed it up very well. In the vast majority of cases, technology has either just been digitalizing what was already there as became a necessity in COVID-19, or unfortunately, it was often just to get press releases. We're going to give iPads to every student. Yeah, great. But the curriculum was never modified, so the students ended up spending the vast majority of their time playing on the iPads. The teachers spent the vast majority of their time acting as IT support, and actually less learning went on. And this was borne out by a 2015 OECD study where they looked at the use of technology in the classroom and scores on the PISA test, the International Standardized Test. And the countries that rated at the highest on the PISA test, which were Finland, Singapore, and South Korea, also had the lowest usage of technology in the classroom, not because they couldn't afford it, but because they tried it and realized that it actually took away from the learning. Unless you go through and deliberately modify the curriculum to be technology enabled, which is a much larger and more expensive process than just introducing the technology, and unfortunately is something that most educational systems and institutions have not been willing to take on.
Suraj, would you agree with that in terms of the curriculums not being fully adapted, or even the curriculums being digital themselves? And also, how do you see this as potentially being solved?
So, Daniel does have a point. Curriculums haven't changed, or have they even been reformed? I do want to add something that one of the things we learned. So Mastercard Foundation hosted a ministerial forum in May this year, and we had 9 ministers attending from different African countries. 3 more countries sent their representatives. When we spoke to them, the focus was on, can we take this as the challenge and opportunity to create resilient education systems to, withstand shocks of the future? So one of the things that we found out is we asked them, how did you cope when learning came to an end, or rather was heavily disrupted during the onset of the pandemic? What did you learn and how did you cope? It is incredible, Tanya, that the majority of them said, we had to revise the curriculum. We had to revise how much we gave out there to enable students to catch up. So the next question for me was, does that say something that perhaps we do need to revise the curriculum? If with a shortened curriculum, you still got the end results that you were aiming for. But that also is another, and I could talk about this over and over. What are our curriculums currently trying to achieve? Are we even preparing the learners for the skills and jobs of tomorrow, or is that needed? Can we take this opportunity where we're now putting a lot of our efforts on digital learning with technology, can we also take this as an opportunity to bring together all the various stakeholders to say, where are the current future trends, and is our current curriculum taking us there? So good point for us to all sort of sit back and assist governments and assist other education stakeholders in this kind of reforming change.
And I'd like to get an educator's perspective on this. I mean, if we're talking about the changing face of the curriculum, I'd like to ask, what are the bottlenecks to achieving that? And sorry, to Professor Barry.
I think that there are probably 4 bottlenecks that I've identified. There are many, but I think firstly in the context of the global South and putting South Africa very firmly in the global South is connectivity. I think unless we have fast internet connectivity that is pervasive across our whole country, I think we'll never have we will be hamstrung in terms of changing and digitalizing or digitally transforming our education system. We can't leave people behind. We can't create more haves and have-nots. So I think we need, as a number one priority, connectivity, fast, affordable connectivity that covers the whole country. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing that we have to think about is, and it's been so important for us, and that's assessment. How do you assess? We are so used to a face-to-face mode of assessment where you herd people into a big room and put them at individual desks and watch that no one cheats, and you can do individual assessment en masse. It's really been so difficult in this sort of digitally kind of managed world to do assessment that is fair and transparent and trustworthy. So I think assessment is the second thing. I think the third thing is really about distance, and it's caused so much mental pressure on our students to be isolated. Learning is a social activity, and yes, our platforms have been very good at delivering content at a distance, but we've yet to find platforms that really create a feeling and a sense of closeness and connectivity and sort of reducing distance. And then the final thing is there's a huge challenge, not in our students in terms of their skills, but in terms of our teachers. I think that the younger generation take to digital like a duck to water, but people in mid-career and older really struggle with working in a digital mode. And I think we should put huge resources into upskilling kind of older teachers and people who've still got a lot to offer, but struggle in the digital world. So I think those are the 4 things I'd say are my top 4 bottlenecks, but there are many more, I guess.
Yeah, and quite some interesting points, which I'd like to get back to, actually, the notion of how can we assist and accompany educators who will be educating digitally. But before we get to that, Dan, I'd also like to get your perspective in terms of the bottlenecks to teaching digitally.
Well, I think one of the first is the curriculum. And had we done what we needed to years back with higher education curriculum, it would have been much easier. Having taught in both K through 12 schools and in universities, one of the biggest problems that I see is that the pedagogy that is appropriate in the younger years of K through 12 is also used as the foundation for the curriculum at most universities, as opposed to andragogy. So we're teaching the students like they were young children. We're causing them to memorize facts, and the assessments that we give are largely regurgitation of facts with maybe a little bit of a case study that they have to do with just what they could remember. And of course, taking that online means, as Professor Berry said, just digitizing it. And then the assessments became a nightmare because we had to use all sorts of technology to try and keep the students from cheating on assessments with materials. At the university level, and as Brad said, students are going to be working in careers that don't even exist. And they're going to be working at these in the 21st century world where memorizing facts is absolutely useless, because you can look up those facts online, and with the rate of change, things that you memorized 5 years ago, 40 or more percent are obsolete now. So it's actually not just a waste of memory space, but it also has you using facts that are now proved incorrect. So what we need to be doing is modifying the curriculum so that it is based on use any resource that you can, get the data that you need, and then everything is about application. And how do you actually apply this and do problem solution? And also going outside of the discipline. We get way too narrow in A levels and then through university, where in the book Range by David Epstein, he points out very well that the most difficult problems are solved not by specialists, but by generalists who can reach across multiple disciplines. And we also need to be working that change into the curriculum. So to me, the bottlenecks are, we're still teaching based on elementary school pedagogy. We are not enabling students to demonstrate their ability to solve problems. We're still making them memorize and regurgitate. And those things are keeping us from being able to effectively use technology.
And Dan, I've got a question here from the audience. Is there support for students with special needs?
Again, if everything is set up appropriately, yes, because someone with special needs, if they're needing to look up facts, can do that using everything from Braille-enabled browsers to speech-enabled, screen reader technology, all of those things. Even as we move forward, possibly just putting on a hat that ties into reading their brainwaves. I know that's the direction that Zuckerberg is trying to go. So, and Elon Musk as well. So there's a lot of things that are available now. And within the next 10 years, I think we're going to see even more things available to make it easy for learners of determination.
Yeah, and I mean, when we take into account all of these bottlenecks, going from connectivity, distance, and the fact that certain students may feel isolated by virtue of not being in a classroom with other students, when we look at the fact that the model hasn't been adapted, that it's still based on elementary teaching, as Dan said, memorizing facts, is EdTech a potential solution to this? And I'd like to ask you, Suraj, what have been your observation in terms of the advancements in EdTech and what they bring to the table?
So one of the biggest advantages of EdTech is the access to education. I take your point that, if you learn using education technology alone, are you kind of, separating yourself away from a classroom environment? And I'll talk about that in a minute. So one of the biggest advancements is that, it has enabled access to education using certain groundbreaking technologies that do allow access, for students that cannot make it to a classroom. And these are various kind of, if you take Africa, for example, there are huge numbers in every country that are never in a formal school. Then you look at girls in secondary school levels who sort of tend to drop out every few days of a month. When you look at that over 2 years, that they've dropped behind so much that actually drop out of school. So some of these EdTech technologies are allowing some of these specific sectors to continuously access education. But the other thing that EdTech is also doing is improving the learning quality. Enough has been talked about, and we can still talk a lot more about the inefficiencies of the current curriculums and how it hasn't been reformed. Even if you don't reform the curriculums, education technology is enhancing what you're learning, how you're learning it. The other thing that EdTech is also doing is it's improving the different students have different cognitive abilities of learning. I think you started this particular, panel on talking about when the Industrial Revolution came about, we started learning in a classroom with a teacher speaking it all. And unfortunately, that's still going on in the majority of Africa. However, what that is doing is it's just picking on the listening ability of students. There are other students who learn better with visualization or touch and feel or, make up as they go. Education technology is now allowing all of that sort of learning to happen so that other students can also kind of pick up at the same pace as those who are just learning, listening in. There's a lot of all that goes directly into students. Now, what also is happening is with more EdTech coming into the hands of learners, educators, the governments are sitting up and thinking, okay, how do we actually, focus EdTech to the gaps and challenges that we're seeing? This is something that we're doing at Mascot Foundation is, trying to address the big challenges that governments face in the delivery and outcomes of education using, African-grown, African-developed education technology solutions. So the other thing that's also happening is EdTech itself is getting innovative, it's picking up steam, and the competition's actually improving the kind of products that are coming in. Again, Tanya, I want to allow others to talk, but there's more advancements that I could even talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you've mentioned quite a few important things. And I know for me, when I was a student, I would have very much liked to have a lot more interaction that the digital world does offer. And you also mentioned how access to technology is one of the primary things, or primary benefits of EdTech. And that's why I actually think of the notion of digital equity. It's something that I've heard. Bradley, you've spoken about this before. What is implied by the notion of digital equity, and how can we ensure that all have access to it?
Yeah, Tanya, and again, I think it's such an important subject that we need to address. But when you consider, just to possibly frame digital equity and the importance of it, is when you consider over the last 2 years, many learners and educators really felt that grave impact of the pandemic on education specifically. And this really was highlighted through school closures, which caused some of that interrupted learning. We very quickly realized that many individuals, students, learners, etc., didn't have access to technology, when they were remote. They weren't ready for home learning, just as an example. And most certainly, a lot of schools weren't, equipped from a technological point of view. And this has really highlighted, I think, the issue that we have, from a digital divide point of view across Africa. So that's the starting point, is the as is. I think we've got to look at it as what do we have today versus how do we need to move in the future, because it is a journey that I think, we will go on as we continue to make progress in many of these elements. The second thing that I would just say is digital equity from a multinational, from an IT standpoint, really relates to every individual having access to knowledge, having access to technology skills, having access to services and opportunities in this new digital economy. That becomes critical for us to all make progress together, because there's an age divide you need to consider, and we cannot just focus on one vertical or one element of society. Very important that we make that that gesture forward. The second thing I would say is empowering teachers, right, and giving them the opportunity to have those future fit soft skills is going to become important, so that they feel comfortable in terms of making the distinction of learning in classroom as well as remotely as well. Now, technology in the past, I think, has been a bit of a luxury item. Today, it has become a critical element in terms of fostering that development for students and learners. And so very important that we focus on educators and we give them the platform, but also the accessibility to their needs in order for them to make progress with their respective learners and their education streams as well. And I would say just lastly, I think a very good point was made. I think, Shiraj, you made the point earlier, is, technology and certainly digital transformation, when we think about it, it's not just about handing out a device, and I think a lot of us get caught up in this is, we've handed out a couple of devices, we've done our job. Well, actually, this is not even the starting point. There are a couple of elements we need to focus on. The device is one element, so hardware and infrastructure. The second thing, as Professor Barry very rightfully said, is connectivity. And we know how many challenges we have across Africa from a connectivity point of view, load shedding, power constraints, etc. That becomes a very, very important element. The third element is learning materials. How do we get people ready, and how do we make this part of the curriculum so that we can foster this environment from a young age through the academy into being very much more relevant in terms of where the world is moving to in the future. And lastly, I would just say is around digital literacy, because again, you can have infrastructure, you can have some materials, and you can have great connectivity, but if people don't know how to use these devices and this technology, then it becomes a very moot point. And so that becomes critical. And to give an example, the US loses roughly $150 million in a day with companies not being online, just to give you the impact, the sense of the impact, which is so very important as well. So, this is an area that is extremely important. And from an HP point of view, we're focusing on a couple of areas where it goes beyond the device. It goes into entrepreneurship, very, very important when you consider, unemployment today, and it goes into what we call HP IDEA, which is the education component, which is learning materials and digital literacy, very, very important.
And when we talk digital literacy, it's on the one hand the learners, the student, but also the educators, the teachers, and ensuring that they are empowered to be able to educate. So Professor Barry, what are some of the best practices in terms of empowering and ensuring that educators, teachers are able to actually deliver the curriculum to the students?
So I think in terms of, and if one focuses on teacher training in South Africa, I think we're in a very bad spot. I think that our teacher training institutions aren't really tackling this well. But I think there's a lot of other things going on that people who are engaging in technology are starting to pick up the potential of it and use it. So there's huge room for innovation. And I think innovators in the kind of education space, I would say the best innovators or the best group of innovators should come from our teachers, because they understand the problems. They understand life in the classroom. They understand the kind of challenges we sit with. And we should try focus on not only teacher training, but encouraging teachers to become innovators and entrepreneurial in their approach to delivering education. You touched on the 4R, and I just want to say that I love technology, but I think that we mustn't interpret 4R as a list of technologies. I think 4R is, and putting it very briefly, it's a collection of principles. And this came out in 2010 in Germany with the idea of Industry 4.0. And the 4 principles are connecting everything. So connectivity, connect everything. The second principle is something that is called a digital twin, and it brings into the digital world a sort of duplicate of the physical world, and that's becoming possible. So I think digital twins are becoming important in all areas. The third principle is hierarchies of systems. So the self-driving car doesn't have a supercomputer driving the car. It's got autonomous subsystems that work and cooperate and collaborate. And then the fourth principle is digital assistants or robots. And I think that when we bring all those 4 things together, we get something fundamentally different. And that, to me, is the fourth industrial revolution. It's not purely saying, oh, well, we'll just list a whole lot of tech and say, lump them together, and that makes 4R. So I might have slightly deviated from your question, but I think that we do need to understand this term 4R better.
Yeah, and to Dan's point earlier, I mean, it's a lot more, and also Bradley mentioned it, it's a lot more than just giving a bunch of students an iPad or and a laptop. We actually need to integrate, we need to adapt the curriculums. But Dan, that brings me to my next question actually. We've talked about the teachers, the lecturers, and how they can be empowered to be able to deliver the curriculum. But I'm also curious to hear about student engagement. I mean, already, we hear of the stories of students who kind of listen for half of the lecture, and then the other half of the lecture they're doing other stuff from the minute that they have a laptop within the lecture class. So how do you do that when they're not even in the room? How do you ensure that they remain engaged, that they remain interested in what is actually being taught?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and it's something that lecturers and teachers struggled with throughout COVID. What I found from teaching classes myself during the COVID pandemic was the best way to do it was to have the classes be completely interactive. So I was using continuous Socratic questioning. So constantly asking the students questions. They never knew when they were going to be called on. And instead of my telling them what the solution was, they had to solve it. And I would ask questions to lead them in the right direction. The other thing that I used a lot was breakout rooms within the technology. So I would drop the students in a breakout room with a problem to solve, and they knew that over the 10 or 15 minutes they had to solve it, I would be popping in and out of the different breakout rooms, making sure that they were having active discussion, and then they were held accountable for coming up with the solution at the end. So by doing all of that, it was possible to keep the students very engaged. It also helps if the university or the K through 12 school is able to give participation marks so that the students actually have some skin in the game, and their participation in the class and their engagement actually ultimately reflects in a way that they can directly understand on their grades. We as educators know that participating will make sure that they get better grades on all of their assessments, but that second level abstraction doesn't necessarily come through as clearly to the students as specifically saying your participation in class over the term accounts for 20 or 25% of your grade, at which point they get really serious about it.
Yeah, and I mean, I love that idea. It's very interactive. It's very new generation, I'd like to call it. And Bradley, I'd like to get your perspective. What are some of the insights that you've seen as HP in terms of the new models for learning, in terms of ensuring that you have student engagement, that the teachers are empowered?
No, very important. I think the first thing is just making sure that the educators, firstly, right, are very comfortable in terms of the models that they have, but also the learning part that they're trying to achieve and the engagement that they're trying to achieve with their students. And so a number of new technologies that I would say teachers are pivoting around today in order to make sure that the in-classroom as well as the remote learning is connected, both teacher to student, but also student to student becomes very important because that social aspect of learning is very important as well. One example is thin client technology that we drive using a base of in-classroom type learning materials that allows teachers to be very effective. It allows them to be very responsive, but also it allows them to be inclusive, and immersed in their students' learning program as well. So they can see who is online, what time they're online, how they're completing their tasks. They can give them new tasks, etc. So it's a collaborative kind of approach to making sure that everybody's immersed at the same time. And it's very KPI, or should I say task-based, in terms of the outcomes that are very, very important, I think, for a lot of these students as well. So that is one aspect that we're looking at. The second thing is, in order to make sure that we continue to drive some of these innovative ideas, we've launched what we call HP Idea, and this is our Innovation Digital Education Academy. And this goes beyond, as I say, the technology aspects of the solution, and it moves more into the literacy and into the materials, which allows us to help those teachers, educators, learners, or even institutions go on a journey to make sure that there is integrated learning paths, that make sense for the curriculum ultimately as well. And then, of course, the next step is entrepreneurship. And HP Life is something that we've introduced to make sure, that once you leave that student life, if you like, there's an opportunity for you to understand what comes next. And of course, again, when you think about Africa and the continent, very, very important that we get through that learning path, and then we get into that stage where you can equip people, with being ready to enter kind of the work and the job market, if you like, to, really contribute back to society. So very, very important. So, those are some of the elements that we focused on, Tanya, at the moment, that play, I think, a very, very key role just in terms of progress, yeah?
Thanks. And I'm particularly interested to hear from you, Professor Barry. In light of what Bradley has just said, he's quite some concepts there, student-to-student learning, interactive learning. What are your thoughts on this and this new way of teaching?
So it would be quite appropriate to quote one of my teachers, and my teacher was a 20-year-old student 3 or 4 years ago. So he is a very serious university student, and he does what we expect of him. But when he goes home at night, he transforms into something else. He's an online gamer. And he spends 4 hours, 5 hours a day playing online games. And he told me what he learns from the classroom at FITS and what he learns playing games. And what he learns playing games is that you never fail. You learn. If you get killed in your game, you get reborn as a new, smarter person. You learn to collaborate. So it's not individuals. He plays his games with a group of people scattered all over the world. And the only way to win the game is to work together with others. So he's learning so many skills playing games that are the opposite skills to what we are teaching in the classroom. We teach that it's bad to fail, that it's cheating if you collaborate, that those things are frowned upon. So I think we should really learn from the games industry in terms of how to engage people, young people, how to get them obsessed with what they're doing and turn that into learning and into acquiring knowledge rather than acquiring swords and shields and stars and whatever they acquire. So I would really learn from our young people and to see how they're embracing technology in their world of fun and turn that into the world of learning.
I understand that you've done quite a bit of work on this.
Thanks. Well, one thing is to understand what that benefit needs to be. What are those outcomes we want out of, the innovation that helps us learn and teach better. Once we have that identified, I think we need to bring everyone together. Government plays a very important part in Africa. If you think about it, the majority of students and teachers belong to public schools, which is the domain of the government. So they need to encourage more uptake of technology, innovative technology that will allow access and improve those outcomes. If those are the bulk of the clients, you have to also remember that the organizations that come up with these innovations are not going to make a lot of money, and they are not going to be invested too heavily either. So I'll come to that point as well, to how we do that. But innovation also comes from, let's address those solutions that the government perceive as, the pain points of education, and kind of channel those towards those addressing those solutions. There are things like impact investment. If the traditional methods of improving technology and kind of making money out of it. Listen, if these innovators do not make money, then they won't be, in that innovating mindset. However, they won't get a lot of business out of students and teachers who really are going to public schools. So if we bring in impact investment, what is that impact that some of these innovations can happen? Then there's a way of kind of nurturing that. The other one is how do we, address maybe some sort of sandbox, a big sandbox. This is something that Mastercard Foundation is planning to do, is what is that one big new technology that we can invest in, test it out amongst various governments to say this will break through either access or the way learning is happening, or even maybe the curriculum change, etc., can happen through these sort of innovations, and that will benefit everyone. And it keeps on, you keep reiterating it, you keep changing it, allow that very, very flexible way of bringing everyone together. Everyone needs to come together. Regulators need to remove the barriers of access of these innovative technologies to sort of test out their solutions. Government needs to be always careful of that the policy is either always up to date and being implemented well to allow other players to come in. The recognition that this is, and I think it was Bradley who said it, that or I'll say it anyway, that, all of this is not a government do it alone. Everyone needs to play their part. It'll never be sustainable if the governments themselves are going to hand out, devices, etc. It's never going to be sustainable. But what can they do? They can make the landscape a lot easier to support technology companies to come in with, easier models of devices or education technology solutions that help learn better. And one thing I did want to sort of put in place also is something that Professor Barry said, and it kind of triggered me. It's one thing to have very, very snazzy kind of, education technology apps, etc. But are we moving the learning needle? So that's also very, very important to bear in mind as we kind of nurture these innovations, that these innovations need to move the learning needle. The science of learning has to happen through these.
Thank you. And one quick question with regards to what you're saying. Whose responsibility is it? I mean, when we're talking education in a digital age on a continent that has such a huge digital divide, whose responsibility is it to bring access to education? And I'd like to ask you that, Siraj.
You see, sorry. It is everyone's responsibility. One is, as I mentioned, governments need to sort of make it easy. The entry points need to be easy. So if they focus, for example, on improving infrastructure, then parents will see the benefits of, purchasing a device for learning, and kind of parents will do whatever they can for the education of their children. So they will make that extra sacrifice to buy a device if there is, better infrastructure, broadband is cheaper. Telcos also need to come into play to say, if it's education content, can we subsidize it? Can we make it free access? But also the various players like ourselves as Mastercard Foundation, we also play an important role in helping test out some of these newer technologies. I'll give an example. There is an organization in Kenya who actually allow learning through a feature phone at the rate of 3 US cents flat rate fee per day for unlimited SMSs to come in to allow students to learn through their parents' device. Students can ask the question, etc. But all that is happening through, ourselves kind of creating a little, incubator kind of sort of process through which this could be tested out, and now governments are helping scale it. So, in short, it's everyone's role to bring this about. Each one of us plays a different role in how we can make this happen. The governments will do it through a much, easier regulatory and better infrastructure environment.
Thanks. And in closing comment, Bradley, I'd like to ask you, what does the future of education look like?
I think it looks good. I think that, I think the first thing we need to do, though, is get very intentional around where we want to make progress, because there's so many things that are required, in order for us to go on this journey. So understanding what the priorities are, very, very important. I think when I say we've got to get intentional, we've got to put a stake in the ground and have very clear outcomes that we expect to see over the next, year to 5 years, I would say. This becomes very important. One of the things that we've done as a HP is we launched our first Africa survey, specifically focused around education. And the results that have come in have basically highlighted digital literacy, as well as innovative and entrepreneurial thinking as being the two areas that are most significant for the continent's progress. So, something that we just trying to make sure that we can foster and contribute towards. The second highlight came back was, that 95% of teachers believe that technology is going to play a very important role in terms of educational progress. And so, making sure that we're aligned to the right outcomes, being intentional around some of those outcomes. As an example, our Innovation Digital Education Academy, we're looking to foster 150 million digital kind of outcomes, equity outcomes by 2030. So very important in terms of how we try and make that progress. But from an HP standpoint, extremely committed. And I think the educational landscape is bright. I think as we come together between educational sectors as well as private sectors, technology, etc., I believe that there will be immense progress, and it will give us the opportunity to leapfrog many other markets, quite frankly, if we do this in a collaborative way.
Indeed, and we could carry on talking about this, but that brings us to the end of this panel. Thank you to my panelists, Dan Atkins, Group CEO of Transnational Academic Group, Suraj Shah, Lead Regional Centre for Innovative Teaching and Learning in ICT at MasterCard Foundation, Bradley Pulford, VP and MD at HP Africa, and Professor Barry Dvolatsky, Director of Innovation Strategy at Wits University.